London, 1751. A baby slips from its mother's arms. Below her, a half-naked man starves on a staircase. A carpenter sells his tools for drink. A woman pours gin into an infant's mouth. Bodies fight, collapse, rot, and disappear into a city that seems to be destroying itself. This is Gin Lane, William Hogarth's most infamous image of the so-called Gin Craze. For generations, it has shaped the way people imagine 18th century London, a city poisoned by cheap spirit, with gin flowing through the streets like a social disease. But Gin Lane is not a snapshot. It is an argument. Hogarth released it in 1751, paired with Beer Street, a second print showing workers fed, busy, and prosperous beneath the supposedly healthier culture of beer. One drink is framed as ruin, the other as order. That contrast was deliberate, and once you see that, the real mystery changes.
The question is no longer simply, what did gin do to London? It becomes, why did so many reformers, officials, writers, and artists need London to see gin as a threat? Because behind the terrifying image was something harder to draw. Gin had become cheap, mobile, and woven into the daily retail life of a rapidly changing city. To understand the panic, we have to leave the print behind and follow the drink into the streets. That journey begins earlier, when policy, grain, distilling, and demand started changing what London could drink. To find the beginning of London's gin panic, you have to look past the bottle and toward policy. In the decades after the Glorious Revolution, English governments encouraged domestic distilling and placed foreign spirits at a disadvantage. Grain could be turned into strong drink at home, and distillers had powerful reasons to expand production. That did not create the gin craze overnight, but it changed the economics of intoxication. One reason was deliberate policy. Restrictions on domestic production had been lifted from 1690, partly to promote English spirits as an alternative to French brandy. Excise on gin rose in the decades that followed, but those early taxes were not designed as a temperance campaign. Government could encourage domestic production, collect revenue from it, and only later discover that the resulting market had become politically difficult to control. By the early 18th century, cheap, grain-based spirits were becoming easier to produce and easier to sell. Estimates used by historians suggest annual per capita gin consumption rose from roughly half a gallon in 1700 to around 2 gallons by 1740. Whatever the exact total, the direction is clear. Strong spirits had moved toward mass consumption. The vocabulary needs care. Public controversy centered on gin, but the laws themselves often spoke more broadly of spirituous liquors. The panic was not always about a standardized botanical drink like modern gin. Gin became the defining symbol of a wider market in cheap, distilled spirits. That difference matters. The material itself was different from ordinary beer or ale. Distillation concentrated alcohol into a smaller volume, making spirits easier to transport, store, divide, and sell in small quantities. But chemistry alone does not explain a social crisis. London was also expanding. Its population was mobile, crowded, unequal, and supplied by an enormous informal economy of shops, stalls, workshops, lodging houses, and street trade. Gin entered that world not as an exotic luxury, but as a commodity that could fit into everyday transactions. And that is where the story starts to change. A government could tax a brewer. It could license a tavern. It could write rules for established drinking places. But what happens when strong drink moves through shops, houses, street sales, and cellars who do not fit neatly inside the older system? Gin was becoming more than a drink. It was becoming a distribution problem. The same policies that helped make domestic spirits plentiful also exposed a weakness. Production could expand faster than institutions designed to govern where, how, and by whom alcohol was sold. The real transformation happened at the point of sale. Gin did not need a grand tavern, a polished bar, or a formal drinking room.
It could move through shops, houses, street sales, and other small-scale channels woven into the ordinary commercial life of the city. A cellar did not always look like a traditional publican. That changed the rhythm of drinking. Beer and ale were deeply embedded in older institutions and routines. Gin could slip between them. A customer did not always need to sit down for an evening. A cellar did not always need the infrastructure of a traditional public house. Strong drink could be bought in smaller amounts, closer to work, lodging, markets, and the crowded streets where daily life happened. For a poor laborer, servant, porter, hawker, or washerwoman, that convenience could matter as much as taste. And for officials, it created a new kind of problem. Regulation works best when the state can see the system it wants to control. A licensed house has an address. A recognized publican has a name. A known venue can be inspected, taxed, fined, or closed. But fragmented retail is harder to map. The more gin moved through ordinary commerce, the less the issue looked like one unruly tavern, and the more it resembled a network. That is why availability became politically explosive. Gin was not simply strong. It was accessible in ways that made older boundaries between drinking place, workplace, household, and street less reliable. So when reformers later described gin as a poison spreading through London, they were responding to more than a chemical substance. They were responding to a commodity that had become unusually difficult to contain. And once that happened, the next question was unavoidable. Who, exactly, was being blamed for the disorder? The answer would reveal that London's fear of gin was also a fear about class, gender, labor, and urban life. Everything was changing. By the 1730s, the argument over gin was no longer only about drinking. It was about who was drinking, where they stood in the social order, and what respectable London imagined might happen if those boundaries collapsed. Pamphlets, sermons, petitions, and reform campaigns repeatedly described gin through the bodies of the poor. Working people appeared as weak, idle, violent, neglectful, or morally degraded. Women were especially visible in this rhetoric, not because surviving evidence proves that women uniquely drove the craze, but because female drinking could be turned into a powerful symbol of disorder inside the household. That distinction matters. A drunken man could be described as a problem of discipline. A drunken mother could be made to represent something larger. Failed care, endangered children, broken domestic order, and a future generation supposedly damaged before it even began. This is why images like Gin Lane hit so hard. They did not merely condemn a beverage. They compressed fears about poverty, labor, crime, gender, and urban instability into one recognizable object: the gin glass. There is another clue that the panic cannot be read directly from the consumption curve. Research on London newspapers finds that coverage of cheap distilled spirits peaked around the passage of the 1736 Act, then declined even as consumption climbed to new heights in the early 1740s. The public argument and the drinking market were not moving in lockstep. That gap matters. A panic has its own political rhythm. Campaigns, petitions, scandals, images, and moments when elite attention suddenly concentrates. The quantity being consumed matters, but it does not by itself explain when fear becomes loudest. And yet the people being represented had their own reasons for buying cheap spirits. For workers living with irregular wages, exhausting labor, insecure lodging, and crowded streets, gin could be woven into social routines, credit, small purchases, moments of relief, and ordinary commerce. None of that made the harms imaginary, but it does mean the moral picture was selective. The panic worked by collapsing different questions into one. Was gin damaging health? Was it disrupting work? Was it encouraging crime? Was it undermining families? Or were reformers also reacting to the visibility of poor people drinking outside the spaces respectable society expected them to use? By the middle of the crisis, gin had become a social diagnosis. And once a drink is treated as evidence that an entire population is slipping out of control, the next step is usually political. London's argument was about to become law. In 1736, Parliament decided that persuasion was not enough. If gin had become too easy to sell, lawmakers would make legal access harder. The new law imposed a duty of 20 shillings per gallon on spirits sold in small retail quantities and required sellers in that market to buy an annual license costing £50. For a wealthy merchant, that was serious money. For a small seller, it could be impossible. The logic was simple: raise the cost of legal retail high enough and the market would shrink. On paper, it looked decisive. In practice, it attacked the wrong layer of the system. Gin had already spread through a fragmented urban economy built around thousands of small transactions. Many sellers operated on margins too narrow to absorb the new cost. Customers were used to cheap access. Enforcement depended on identifying illegal sellers, gathering evidence, bringing cases, and persuading communities to cooperate with a law many people saw as excessive. The result was not orderly retreat. It was resistance. Unlicensed selling continued. Informers became targets of hostility. Evasion multiplied. The government could write a law that made gin expensive to sell legally, but it could not instantly erase the network that had made gin ordinary. That dependence on informers created a second battle inside the crackdown. Historical research on the 1736 Act shows London communities punishing informers and using popular pressure to frustrate enforcement. An excise officer could read the law, but he did not automatically know which room, shop, cellar, or private house was selling spirits that night. To turn an illegal sale into a prosecution, the state often needed someone close enough to the trade to identify a seller. So enforcement became personal. The conflict was no longer only Parliament against gin. It could become informer against neighborhood. That failure exposed the central weakness in the crackdown. Parliament had treated the problem as if supply could be switched off by statute. But gin was not moving through one factory gate or one licensed tavern. It was moving through a city. And cities are difficult to govern when the commodity being targeted is cheap, portable, familiar, and profitable enough for new sellers to replace the old ones. The ingenuity of evasion became part of the legend of the Gin Craze. In a memoir published in 1755, Dudley Bradstreet described a scheme in which a cat sign was fixed to a window and gin was passed through a hidden pipe. Customers called to the Puss. Money changed hands without a normal face-to-face sale, and the seller remained concealed inside. Bradstreet was writing his own adventures, not producing an official report, so the episode should not be treated as a statistical picture of London. But as an illustration of the enforcement problem, it is almost too perfect. When a law targets a cheap, portable commodity moving through flexible retail, sellers do not simply disappear. They adapt. The harsher the law looked on paper, the clearer the enforcement problem became. Was London fighting gin? Or was it fighting the retail system that allowed gin to survive every attempt to suppress it? The 1736 law did not fail because Parliament lacked ambition. It failed because ambition and enforceability were not the same thing. The license was expensive. The duty was heavy. The penalties were severe enough to make the policy look almost prohibitory, but a law only matters when someone can make it real. That meant finding illegal sellers. It meant identifying premises. It meant securing testimony. It meant relying on informers who could become hated figures in their own neighborhoods. It meant persuading local officials to enforce a policy that many Londoners resisted, ignored, or learned to evade. The state had tried to make gin disappear from legal commerce. Instead, it pushed more of the trade beyond the boundaries it could easily see. That was the reversal. The crisis was no longer simply about how much punishment Parliament could write into a statute. It was about whether government could control the places, people, and transactions through which gin reached the street. Small sellers could return, Customers could shift where they bought. Enforcement could be resisted. New channels could replace closed ones. The market adapted faster than the law. This was more than administrative embarrassment. It exposed the distance between a government that could define illegal commerce in Westminster and a sprawling city where daily enforcement depended on cooperation, information, and local power. By 1743, Parliament was retreating from the extreme structure of 1736. The new settlement cut the burden dramatically, replacing de facto prohibition with a much cheaper licensing regime. And here the story becomes more interesting. Consumption began to decline after 1743, during the less spectacular regulatory phase, not only after the famous Act of 1751. A more inclusive licensing system and more effective excise control appear to have helped. The lesson was not that weak rules always work better than strong ones. It was that a rule the state can actually administer may matter more than a severe rule that large parts of the market simply refuse to obey. That did not mean the panic was over. It meant lawmakers were learning something uncomfortable. They could not govern intoxication by attacking gin as an isolated object. The cellar, the premises, the license, the customer, and the street were all part of the same mechanism. Once officials recognized that, the next campaign would look different. And so would the image used to justify it. By 1751, the argument over gin had acquired its most unforgettable image. William Hogarth published Gin Lane beside Beer Street, two prints designed to be read against each other. The timing matters. The pair appeared in February. The 1751 Gin Act would not receive royal assent until June, so the prints were not retrospective illustrations of a finished policy. They entered a live political struggle over what Parliament should do next. In Beer Street, workers eat, build, trade, and celebrate. The city looks productive. Bodies are sturdy, tools remain in their owner's hands. Across the pair, Gin Lane is collapse made visible. A mother drops her child. A man pawns his tools. Violence, sickness, neglect, and ruin crowd the scene until the entire neighborhood seems poisoned. It is powerful because it feels like evidence, but that is exactly why we have to be careful. Gin Lane was not a census, it was not a police report, it was not a photograph of a typical London street. It was persuasion. Hogarth compressed many anxieties into one theatrical nightmare, then placed that nightmare beside an idealized culture of beer. The contrast told viewers what to fear and what to prefer. That does not make the print useless, it makes it more revealing. Gin Lane shows us how reformers wanted the crisis to be understood, as a threat to labor, family, health, property, and public order all at once. The image turned a complicated social system into a single visual accusation. Hogarth was not working in a vacuum. In the same year, the novelist and London magistrate Henry Fielding published an enquiry into the causes of the late increase of robbers. Fielding treated cheap spirits as part of a wider crisis of crime and public order. The print and the pamphlet did different things, but they belonged to the same reforming moment. Neither was a neutral measurement of a typical London street. Both were interventions in an active political argument. And that accusation traveled farther than the licensing debates that produced it. Most people do not remember the administrative details of 1736. They remember the falling baby. They remember the starving bodies. They remember gin as a substance capable of destroying a city. But by 1751, lawmakers had already learned that frightening images could not solve the enforcement problem. The next decisive move would come through the market itself. Not simply by condemning drinkers, by changing who could legally sell the drink, under what conditions, and inside which kinds of premises. Across the city. By 1751, Parliament was no longer trying to repeat the blunt experiment of 1736. The new approach focused more closely on the structure of retail. The act restricted distillers from supplying unlicensed retailers and narrowed legal retail toward more substantial, identifiable sellers and premises. Instead of trying to make spirits vanish behind one spectacular barrier, it made legal distribution depend more heavily on a chain the authorities could recognize. That difference mattered. An identifiable seller can be monitored. Licensed premises can be inspected or sanctioned. A retailer with a business and a license to lose has a reason to stay inside the rules. This did not suddenly make London sober, nor did it create perfect enforcement. But it represented a shift in what government thought it was regulating. The target was no longer merely gin as a dangerous liquid. It was the route from distiller to retailer to customer. The aim was not perfect visibility. London was far too large and too adaptive for that. The aim was greater visibility than before. In other words, Parliament was moving from prohibition-like severity toward a system it had a better chance of administering. The shape of enforcement had changed. Instead of relying mainly on the hope that every illegal street-level sale could be discovered and punished, the law created more leverage upstream. If authorities could narrow the legal path between distiller and retailer, they did not need perfect knowledge of every customer or every glass. That was still an imperfect solution, but it attacked a point in the chain where licenses, premises, and commercial relationships left more traces than an anonymous sale in the street. The distinction is subtle, but it is central to the story. The state had learned that intoxication was organized through places, transactions, and institutions. Change those, and you could change the conditions under which drinking happened. But even here, there was a trap. The fall in gin consumption is often told as proof that the 1751 law finally solved the crisis. History is less convenient than that. Consumption had already begun to decline after the high point of the early 1740s. The 1751 Act mattered, but it entered a market that was already changing. Then, economic pressure intensified. Bad harvests pushed grain prices upward. Grain mattered twice. It was an input for distillers and a basic necessity for households. When food absorbed more of a poor family's income, less money remained for everything else, including drink. Real incomes also came under pressure. That means the continuing decline cannot be credited to one law, as if Parliament had finally discovered a perfect switch. Several forces were moving together. Legal distribution became more manageable. Excise control improved. Grain became more expensive. Household purchasing power tightened, and political pressure against gin remained intense around the 1751 campaign. This matters because neat endings are seductive. They turn a messy historical process into a moral lesson. London drank too much. Government became serious. The right law arrived, and the crisis ended. But the evidence points to something more complicated. By 1751, the state had become better at organizing the legal trade around recognizable sellers and premises. At the same time, the economic conditions that had helped cheap spirits flourish were becoming less favorable. So 1751 was important. It was not magic. The gin craze faded because the system around gin changed. Law, retail, prices, purchasing power, and political pressure moved together. London was not abandoning gin. It was reorganizing the conditions under which it circulated. And that leads to the final reversal. The panic could disappear even while gin itself survived. The drink remained. What changed was the world that had made it terrifying. Gin did not vanish when the panic faded. By the later 18th century, the conditions that had made gin politically explosive were no longer identical to those of the 1730s. Retail was more regulated. The most aggressive phase of anti-gin campaigning had passed. Economic conditions had shifted. The state had found a more durable way to manage the trade. But people still drank gin. That is why the end of the gin craze should not be mistaken for the end of gin. A moral panic can collapse long before the object at its center disappears. The crucial transformation was not that gin suddenly became respectable. It was that the relationship between drinker, seller, premises, and state had been reorganized. And that brings us back to Hogarth. The nightmare endured because images travel farther than administration. The falling baby in Gin Lane survived in memory far more clearly than the licensing structures, economic pressures, and retail reforms that actually reshaped the city. Put a modern glass of gin beside Hogarth's Gin Lane, and the distance between them feels enormous. One belongs to a familiar drink, the other belongs to a nightmare. But they are the same story. The terror of 18th century London did not come from liquid alone. It came from what happened when distilled spirit became cheap enough, mobile enough, and commercially flexible enough to move through the daily life of a crowded city faster than older institutions could comfortably govern it. That is why the panic attached itself to so many fears at once. Poverty, work, motherhood, crime, disorder, the street. Gin became a container for anxieties that were larger than gin. And when Parliament responded, the first instinct was to attack the object directly, tax it heavily, price small sellers out of legality, and punish the trade. That failed. The more durable shift came when government treated intoxication as a system of sellers, premises, licenses, customers, and enforcement. Even then, law was only part of the change. Prices, harvests, incomes, and political pressure moved too. So the gin craze did not end because London defeated a bottle. It faded because the world around that bottle was reorganized. That is what Hogarth's print hides and reveals at the same time. It exaggerates the city into a moral nightmare, but it also preserves the fear that made the nightmare believable. The sense that an ordinary commodity had escaped the boundaries meant to contain it. The glass survived. The panic did not.